the very good social work that's being done. I am just an architect, so I don't have expertise in the social work, but I would like to share with you today some ways of living in and around Oregon. My name is Joe Lambke, and as an architect, I primarily focus on the physical aspects of living, creating physical spaces. However, past research and experience have taught me that organization, especially the difficult social services, make a significant contribution to building great things. So great buildings emerge from great clients, and great places emerge from people interacting fairly. So it was really nice to hear Ed Blackburn's conversation about housing and this idea of a coordinated care. Architecturally, in the last 120 years or so, city planning has been focused on segmenting different functions of living into different zones. And just like Ed is working on coordinated care, architecturally, the kidCities mechanism that we're going to talk about today is also working on coordinated places for people to live. And part of the reason it's called kidCities is because city planning in the 20th century was really designed to keep children out. It's kind of a funny thing, but cities were dangerous 200 years ago, and cities have grown tremendously, and now children need to live in the city. So we have to take a more coordinated approach to enable all people to live in a city. So we'll review some past research and experiences. I'll present the kidCities mechanism, and then we'll illustrate some projects that have been built that hint at the future for architecture and people and how they can work in the future. So 5 ideas to kind of frame this today. Interactions, character, places, civility, and dynamism. Dynamism being one of the keys, but we'll start with interactions. Many years ago, I was able to live in this small Tuscan village for a short amount of time. And living here demonstrated the repetitive qualities of community life. Repetition, not like assembly line work in Detroit, but the repetition of seeing the same people day in and day out contributes to our understanding of others. And I think I could try again. It was loud. That's better. Good? Okay. Maybe it just needs to be here. So that repetition of experiences helps us to understand other people. By seeing other people when they're happy, sad, confused, mad, playful, we can begin to understand the infinite variety of people, and that's something that I've always enjoyed. And hearing the stories about successful social workers today reinforces that notion that all people are uniquely different and can be very touching in different moments in their lives, or very difficult. One of the things that this experience in this Tuscan village taught me was about haystack rock here in Oregon. I learned actually where that form came from. But back to the main point, events in this small town included tractor fairs for the farmers, religious events occurring throughout the year, people with different characters interacting frequently under different conditions. Even when it was raining, people would gather at the town gate after lunch to gossip. Life was not always pretty there. Change there rarely happened. And while this town was immensely enjoyable, it was clear that I was the traveler, I was the guest. But the experience of repetitive interactions many years later led me to this book. So I don't know if any of you have heard of this book, The Evolution of Cooperation. One of the key stories in the book is that back in World War I, during trench warfare, cooperation formed occasionally between
opposing armies in the trenches who simply didn't want to die. So the soldiers stopped shooting at each other. And this is a really bizarre phenomenon. It began early, during dinner times, the shooting would diminish. And over these repetitive experiences, sooner or later, they simply stopped shooting at all. And the only way this cooperation was broken is when the higher colonels in the army started rotating troops through the positions, eliminating the repetitive experiences. And then the soldiers started shooting again. So this is a very natural phenomenon, the idea that cooperation comes out of repetitive interactions. And yet, like I say, in the 20th century city planning, we segmented character out. We had housing here, we had government district here, the central business district, an education district, a school district. We separated things out. So if we want to coordinate care of communities, we need to find solutions to the isolation and frustration that's out there. I'm sure all of you know a lot more about this than I, so I don't want to dwell on it. Except there's one phrase that is commonly said, like-minded groups. And I find it kind of troubling because it seems so boring, I guess, to me. I don't understand the attraction. But, so in any case, rather than that kind of isolation, we want to bring out more character, and we need to be able to accept different characters. And then, most importantly, in terms of communities, maintain the good of the commons. So I'm going to jump to France, oddly enough, to discuss character. They are characters. The French are interesting. But they had a similar situation. 2,000 migrants, they call them migrants, not immigrants. They had 2,000 migrants living homeless in this not very desirable section of North Paris. And after a short amount of time, they decisively acted to disperse the people as a means of accommodation. And in some of the dialogue that went on, they talked about hospitality. And I thought that was an interesting way to look at it. Homelessness as a word is kind of a consumerist and very housing focused, but the problems are not necessarily the house, it's the social services. So if we think of it as hospitality, like the French did, or some of the French did, I should say, these guests might be unwanted, they might be unfortunate, and they might be unexpected. But society has to host them in some way, shape, or form. And one solution that we can think about, and we suggested it in one of the earlier sessions today, was the idea of dispersal. How do we disperse the need for housing across different communities in Oregon? And one simple idea real quickly, which would need a lot more work, would be to have a state law that says there's X percentage of people that need housing, and every community, every development needs to have that percentage of needy housing in the development, whether it's existing or new. And something like that levels the playing field across the state, so there's no decrease in property values. One of the things that old 20th century zoning laws addressed was property values. People were afraid that if different groups move into a neighborhood, the property value will decrease. And that's still a common feature of zoning laws. But if you uniformly apply it across the state, then the property values won't change because it's a uniform application. So that's just a simple idea about how we might go about things. And as we think about how can we increase repetitive interactions between diverse people, the why is easy, it creates cooperation, but how is difficult. So one of the things that we looked at is trying not to produce an evenness in arranging physical space. So uniformity, equality, this evenness is something that diminishes the ability to increase repetitive interactions. This picture is taken in Oregon, and we could see the uniformly yellow siding, which in reality is maybe a little unsightly. But its attractiveness as an image comes from its contrasting colors, light, texture, form, and knowing that this image is an isolated extract from reality. And this is, in a sense, kind of how we sell this segmented housing solution. So one of the things we need to get at is zoning regulations, and the other is developer incentives. I'm sure all of you are, again, familiar with developer incentives. There's been a lot of laws passed recently about encouraging housing from developer approaches. But the housing is kind of uniform. It's a facility for housing of a certain segment of society. And we want to kind of expand that and make it a more robust situation. So instead of incentivizing a segmented marketplace into like-minded groups, how can we create more mixed-use places for diverse people? And architects, we have our own set of constraints that we have to work with. And minimally, what typically happens is architectural firms specialize in designing certain kind of places for certain specific segments. One firm might specialize in higher education, another firm might specialize in office spaces, and so on and so forth. And that's happened because we segment the marketplace. It's a complicated and it's a very deterministic approach. And adaptation then becomes limited to color or materials. So here's a great example of how zoning laws and development practices here in Portland have contributed to this kind of very evenness of the landscape. With variations in color and so on and so forth, and it's not to say the buildings are bad. It's the cumulative effect of zoning laws and development practices. As we figure out how to build places better, instigating many interactions and supporting an increased understanding of many different people, one of the things that we look at is accommodating the formation of self-organization spaces where communities can imprint their evolving character. There's a great example in Portland in the old days of the street intersections and painting a little design would be a really small-scale self-organization space. So as we work to evolve existing places into these more dynamic ones, let's begin to examine the notion of a place. What is a place? Tokyo is a place, it has 30 million people. Castiglione Fiorentino, the town I lived in, has 6,000 people. In Portland and Pendleton, there's all these different places of all different sizes. But what's common to them is that a place is where people come together and interact. So people and cultures across history have valued places at any scale that are defined by a permeable boundary and an active center. So a permeable boundary is kind of like personal space. It's where one place relates to another place, and the boundary occurs where urban life relates to the ecological environment beyond which we live. Farmers markets are an indicator of the intangible attraction, but more so this fuzzy boundary space is where invention happens. It's neither the saturated urban core nor the open space beyond. And it's where invention happens, and by contrast, hard walls in any civilization, if you go back to the Great Wall of China, are attempts to resist evolution. And as a living system, we need to encourage the evolution. So moving between the ecological open space and the active center represents the desire and the opportunity to learn. So fresh ideas are emergent in the permeable boundary space, and active centers are the most frequently used space. Inside the active centers, repetitive interactions, if they're really dense, create over time the structures, regulations, and organization of widely varied social interactions. This is how cooperation then emerges. Interactions add value to a place, and eventually it becomes civilization. It gains character. So simultaneously, the ability to come and go, the sense of freedom to participate or not, via the openness of transportation is essential. It's also the means of communication. So these places are dynamic, multi-scale, and then networked together. This is something that the old Tuscan villages didn't have much networking. However, today we have this kind of very high-level networking, so we can find new patterns of mixed-use places at distinct levels of activity. And this corresponds to people's interests, expectations, and responsibilities, which are related to the physical place. I'm going to jump a little forward here. So in the 20th century, again, we segmented things out. We had different zoning districts, we have zoning maps, and we say what belongs where. But what we're realizing is a mixed-use environment is more natural to live in, and again, gets at that idea of coordinated care, coordinated living. So how do we, that's all great, but when we have such big, huge cities like Tokyo, or Portland is, roughly just under 3 million people, if you look at the metropolitan statistical area. So when we look at something this big, how do we juggle this? How do we make a mixed-use place? I mean, there's already arguments about single-family homes and increasing density and traffic congestion and so forth. So one of the things that we've learned in our research is looking at cities as complex adaptive systems, and it brings life to the fractal nested structure with self-similar patterns of an evolving urban form. So it's no longer that we can create a fixed plan for the city. Like, imagine making a plan for a city that you think is going to be there in 50 years. It's more accurate to think of it as a living system, and it's going to evolve. So what can we do to encourage the evolution? How do we manage the evolution? So, so to get at these interactions, how do we define appropriateness? And here I want to talk about civility. It's a tricky word, and we can go back to the idea of hospitality and appropriateness when accepting others, and the right to share a place. It requires a kind of respect for each other, a kind of civility that is not predetermined. There's an old idea of civility, and then there's a forward-looking idea of civility. This particular picture comes from the movie The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance by John Ford. And there's a great lecture by Robert Pippin about this movie that you can find on YouTube. But he basically is looking at Pippin's idea is that freedom is the outcome of treating others with respect. So freedom comes only after you've treated others with respect and civility. So civility is the prerequisite for freedom. And there's more to this. It's like there's an attitude of respect for others as free and autonomous agents equal to us. It is the benevolent attitude of going beyond the strict rational calculation of costs and benefits. I think, again, that's what Ed was talking about. He didn't take that job with a rational calculation of costs and benefits. He took it on trust, and we try not to humiliate others, we try to get along in society, and that's the kind of open-ended, futuristic kind of civility that we're talking about. So kidCities brings these notions of appropriateness into urban planning. So the mechanism that we use to organize these places are 7 levels of place. And we talk about this in terms of the physical place, street, neighborhood, district, city, metropolis, region, and continent. But it also relates to the speed of transportation. So different vehicles, walking, cycling, an automobile or subways, faster transportation like a metropolitan-wide transportation, high-speed rail at 250 miles an hour, and airplanes at the continental level. So there's all kinds of natural phenomena that get into, that have to do with these 7 levels. And I would say the social services also could fit into these 7 levels. Some of the examples earlier were like, somebody said if I hit 4 tents in front of my business, after a while it gets to be too cumbersome, and I don't want to deal with it. And that's something at the street level. There's like this kind of 4 tent problem. But then there's emergency rooms and those problems, which are really at the city level. And then there's the kind of community care for critical response center, which might be at the district level. And so I think we can help to coordinate the care using these levels as well. And examples of good governance, which is a whole other issue in Portland right now. We find levels are used to distribute responsibility, resources, and importantly, to obtain useful feedback and direct the feedback to the relevant decision-making process. And so that you don't think these patterns are arbitrary, like any good pattern recognition machine, you might be wondering where they came from. In one example, it turns out that horses happen to prefer certain speeds of travel, which correspond to their oxygen consumption. And over the millenniums, human beings have recognized that horses travel at these certain patterns, and then we developed terminology to refer to each distinct speed: walking, trotting, and galloping. And what's really cool is that horses' most preferred speeds are related to their optimal energy consumption. So the same thing goes back to this kind of organization of levels. If we organize care at these levels, it resolves some of the, it helps us manage the care better in a way that's more closely related to a place. It's why we have one OHSU instead of spread throughout the entire region. And then we have smaller care levels and so forth. But if we can refine these levels, we can create a more optimized system, a more appropriate system. So here's another example about transportation. I mean, as an architect, when we design places, we think of how people will move throughout space, right? We have exit doors, and so on and so forth. And so we coordinate flow of people at different levels into space, and this is what gives character to space. And then people turn the space that we create into a place. So this chart illustrates how we found these levels, and one of the difficulties that happened last century was that up until 1900, in all of history, there were only 3 levels of transportation: walking, riding a horse, and maybe a waterway. And eventually a steam-powered train, but steam-powered trains really only went about 35 miles an hour. But then since 1900, all of a sudden we have 7 levels of transportation, going up to 600 miles an hour. That's not counting rockets because it's not quite there yet. But the huge expansion is what challenged us intellectually to deal with city planning, which is why the modernists had such a hard time with city planning. It was very difficult to predict the effects of the automobile on places. And Portland's growth boundary was a late solution to a problem. It was a kind of a nice short-term solution to what they recognized it quickly and they acted quickly. I mean, you couldn't have recognized what the automobile would do in 1940, but by the time Portland instituted its growth boundary, it was pretty obvious the effects of the automobile, including producing isolation and frustration. So anyhow, as a growing city, the opportunity exists for Portland to coordinate its current transportation policies with the density of physical space. Instead of creating that evenness of density that we saw in that previous picture, we can begin to create an increased spatial contrast. So the kidCities mechanism works to form distinct places in 2 ways. One, by coordinating access to transportation, and 2, inside communities, by creating self-organization spaces where people can take action and determine their own local space. So kidCities effectively evolves into increased spatial contrast, which then becomes a more recognizable environment. One of the things about the evenness is we don't gain a sense of place. It's so even, everything seems uniform. You can't tell where is the care center, where is the educational center. We can't find things. There's another great term is polycentric. Is another current term being used by economists actually to describe the same phenomenon. So without getting into too much detail about the mechanism, we worked on a project in Wujiang, China, and we found that visibility becomes very essential. I mean, China has obviously more than 1 billion people. They have all kinds of issues. They have many levels that are overlapping. And we found that visibility assists people to associate a particular governance issue with a place to resolve it. Visibility coordinates the scale of an issue with the appropriate inclusion of people, resulting in more accurate collective decision making. It also kind of eliminates the fatigue of too much information. So to update the effectiveness of US representative democracy, we could think more like biological engineers. We can work to change operational processes, which will then construct a different intended physical result. So implementing kidCities increases the visibility of places, and there's more. So this is kind of a fitness landscape, which is a biological term to describe the operating environment that places live in. And so different physical landscapes reflect different governance organizations. Some are limited by outsiders. So you could, in city planning world, Houston is used as a great example because there's no zoning code whatsoever. And in Houston, outside entities, including currently a Japanese company that's building a rail system between Houston and Dallas. So if you have nothing, then you can be ruled by outside interests. And in a globalized world, there's some really big money out there that can influence your place. So if you have nothing, you might be influenced by outsider influence. In a kind of very even situation, you're more influenced by in-group social norms. They say, come on, you need to be the same as everybody else. And so that kind of very steady physical landscape acknowledges this kind of in-group social norms, which originally came in Paris when they used to align the cornice heights. They said everybody has to have their cornice height of their building at the same level. And then others are prone to catastrophic collapse. So the bottom one, if you have a single peaked fitness landscape, and the easy example there is Detroit. If you take Detroit and your main industry collapses, the city collapses with it. And so and this is kind of some of that economic information is also related to this. And so what we're proposing, what the kidCities proposes, is a highly correlated multi-scale fitness landscape with increased spatial contrast. So you can see the third one, there might be a tall center, and then there's multiple medium-sized centers, and then there's even smaller centers as well. But they all have a center, they all have a place, an active center, and they all work at different scales. And we think that this highly correlated multi-scale fitness landscape will be more robust to economic activity, especially in the period of globalization. And then self-organization spaces. This is an old diagram of some of the basic principles of a self-organization space. So, for lack of a better entity, we said nature and communication is the green at the top on the left is the key. And there's some abstract thing, human beings love nature, and so we knew that had to be a part of it. And then there's this kind of smaller scale is the blue circle, and then there's the self-organization space itself, which is the red grid, and then there's some kind of transportation system. And then generally, no matter where you're at, there's always some direction that points to the larger scale entity, the larger scale thing. And so this is just 4 scales here, but your personal desk is your self-organization space. You have a window, you look out at the picture. You have a doorway, which is your access point.
and there's usually some direction down the corridor that takes you to the elevator or to somewhere else. But you can bring that up to a house. There's 3 bedrooms in a house, and a living room is a self-organization space. And there's some way down the street that's going to take you to the bus stop. And you can do that, again, with a group of houses on a street. You can do it at a neighborhood scale, a district scale, a city scale, and a metropolis scale. So when we look at Portland, Portland's really a metropolis that extends from Gresham to Hillsborough. It's really a gigantic entity, the metro. And we're beginning to learn that we need metro governance because it really is one economic engine. So these are some of the key parameters that we'll illustrate in some of the projects. So to review, interaction, repetition forms cooperation. Character avoids isolation and frustration if we can accept it in others. Places have centers and boundaries. Civility is about hospitality and appropriateness. And dynamism is visible in scale and contrast. So here's a few projects. Now, this first project is really fun. It's located in Singapore. It's not ours. It's by Woha Architects. Singapore is roughly twice as big as Portland. And I bring this up because it's a great project to illustrate some of these principles. But it's also a good project to illustrate that there's no reason to be afraid of large projects. So in contrast to aligned cornices and division street repetition, we can see that this is a large project, but it has a very large and very inviting self-organization space at grade here, with plenty of amenities from schools to food to businesses and so forth. And of course it's a brand new project, so there's plenty of greenery at the street level and throughout the project. But let's look deeper at how it's organized. So if we go to the very top of the building, tall buildings have tops, which are kind of like the end of a peninsula, like Key West, Florida is a great peninsula, but also Astoria, Oregon. There's something weird when we go to Astoria, there's something special about being out on the end. And so tops of buildings have that same character, and we can use that as a special place, and this building does that quite well. And when we go to the floor plan, you can begin to see how big this project is. One of its key Asian features is the feng shui of every unit having multiple views. Many modernist blocks became very large. There's great ones in France and Chicago and New York of long, long blocks of buildings with many units. And in those older projects, you might have a 4-bedroom unit and a living room and so on, and all of your views would only face one direction. They might face east, they might face north, you might never get any sunlight, they might face south. But in here, all of the units are designed to get light from at least 3 directions, which is pretty amazing in a high-rise building. But it's very common in Asia. So that's one really great feature about thinking differently about large projects. And then there's different kinds of units in here as well. There's small units, large units, for families to be able to grow and shrink as time goes on, because that's what living systems do. I apologize about my random, here's another, so this is now on one of the more common floors where there's self-organization spaces for, say, 10 floors at a time. So within the project, there's all these different scales, like even with 2 units share a common entry point. There's large common spaces, smaller common spaces for different scales of units. And so when you put it all together, it looks like this. So you can see kind of the grouping of 10 floors at a time have a larger park space, but each floor has a little park space. And so you can begin to see neighborhoods. So we could say there's almost 12 neighborhoods inside this building, which this is part of the growing world we live in. I mean, we know our neighbors within eight housing
units near us, which might be on a corridor in a high-rise, or it might be in a neighborhood on the street. Your next-door neighbors and across the street, a few others. And it's the same idea, it's just in a high-rise. And it's inside a very dense and robust city. So there's all kinds of walkable places. I mean, you can imagine here, there's no need for a car, obviously. And it can be quite beautiful. I mean, there is park space surrounding the project. So there's places for people to live, work, learn, and play. And here's more of kind of what these common spaces are, common neighborhood spaces, can be in a large project. I mean, so one of the challenges we have in this country is funding. I mean, part of the reason they were able to do this in Singapore is the government regulations and the development model are entirely different than ours. So they were able to do this because of that. But we could still learn from what they've done. At a much smaller size, we proposed this small project, we call it increased contrast. The same principles can be applied on small projects. This project proposed a higher contrast on a gently sloped site. It's only 16 feet wide, so it's very narrow, again, gives us more views, and it included 4 modestly sized housing units with an outdoor self-organization space, which collected people when they took a pedestrian walk to get to the downtown kind of Hillsdale commercial area. Here's the little tiny floor plan. Again, it's only 16 feet wide. And you can see kind of the self-organization space. And here's a view with the bridge over the ravine to the little self-organization space, which is the way you would exit the building to go to the commercial area. In an even smaller example, you could do it in a restaurant. We designed this restaurant, a very fashionable dining room up front. But if you look at the configuration, what we did was we used a novel host and waiting station to complement 2 different dining rooms, each with its own distinctive character. So again, trying to create places with a distinctive character. So 2 different dining rooms, each has a different flavor. So the front one was the fashionable one where people come and go, and the back one is the kind of, I know the chef, let's go, we can sit in the kitchen, you know, and it's not really in the kitchen, you don't want the mess and the noise of being in a real kitchen, but it feels like it's in the kitchen and you see the chef more, so that was another idea. And then there's other functions, it's not just residential or dining. For this project, sometimes the self-organization space is in 3 dimensions. It wasn't in plan at this particular location. At Audio Consultants, we created a self-organization space at the entrance and checkout counter, which is centrally located vertically in 3 dimensions. So I had to use a building section to show this. But it's the same principle. We have a self-organization space in the center, the active center, and we have 5 very distinctly different listening rooms for the business, all surrounding the great space. So there's a loft room for like a hipster loft. There's a condominium room for a small condominium stereos, a super expensive stereo room, a theater room, and then a mid-range room. And all of them have different characters. And actually, technically, there's a kitchen. That yellow area is the kitchen, if you will, so maybe 6. Another project that we did, which is complex, is large. What about other buildings? I mean, how do we work? So personally, I have always enjoyed working with quirky, really smart scientists. They're exceedingly focused on some minutiae detail of our universe. And it's really fun. There's a fine line between scientists and the mentally ill. As you know, the brain works in strange ways. But when we designed it and built the Theory and Computing Sciences building, it was for some of the world-leading scientists that were not necessarily world-leading in social interactions. But we had fun, and it's a great place. So this large interdisciplinary research facility has all these specialized researchers, and Jim Feigl was the administrator, and he had to deal with all these idiosyncrasies. that one might expect of 600 super focused scientists, all working in one space. People who were not like-minded at all, but each had unique and valuable talents. And so for their project, we created a place where very different people could cooperate on challenging problems like individualized medicine and DNA research, climate change, cosmology, and all kinds of other natural and unnatural phenomena. And of course, any supercomputing research facility would not be complete without a conference center and one of the world's fastest supercomputers. However, these are the obvious tools. Over the years using this place, the scientists have realized that their building is an equally valuable tool. It encourages cooperation without a social director, planning and managing events. You need to meet so-and-so. Instead, the building instigates spontaneity and interactions that lead to natural collaborations. So here are some of the interior spaces where the workers work, and they have these kind of intimate area zones. And the exterior is multi-scale, and here's the conference center. And one more project, in contrast to this where they think about things, the next project is where they actually make real things. So it's not often that a community converts a jail into a community center. And here we help them, I think you could still see the bars on the middle window. We helped them convert this jail into a community center. It started about 10 years ago, and it goes slowly, but now we're working on another cool project in its infancy. Their self-organization space currently is the one-story area to the south. The three-story jail is to the north, and that's where the mill is. But that's really an industrial facility. So here we're taking a community center, and there's a factory in it, which is great. So there's the mill on the right. You can see the existing jail. You probably can't see all the razor wire on it, but this is after the mill was finished. And now we're building a glass roof over the courtyard in the center to make it more usable year-round, since it is in Maine. Lastly, just to kind of open things up a little bit, mixed use. In America, mixed use has become apartments with retail on the ground floor. To try to address it more realistically, when I say we had a factory and a community center, we want mixed communities, this kind of coordinated care approach. Some of it began, this is a great story, in 1976, it started in Tokyo, where a gentleman merged a nursery school and a home for the aged. And those are really two interesting functions to try to work together. As social workers, I'm sure many of you know a lot more about it than I do. I know it's not easy, but it has been done in many places, and it's a great idea. So that's one. The other thing about it is that, of course, it makes great marketing photos for fundraising and so forth. This was in the UK. They're actually pushing it really hard right now. So I don't know why it took them, 35, 45 years from 1976 till now, but in the last 5 years, the UK is pushing this integrated elder care with child care programs. And then in Australia, there's a movement called the Nightingale Movement, which is building a small number of mixed community projects. Sorry about the noise. And the underlying structure, they're trying to change the underlying structure of development and zoning. So these development and funding practices, they've realized that in order to create these new places, they need to change those. And another cool project is in Holland, where university students are given free room and board in exchange for assisting the elderly. This program too has special appeal because many elderly people would prefer to live in an intriguing setting like near a university. This program too has special appeal because they enjoy it. Programs. And then in the US, it's happening slowly. These are two programs that are somewhat random, but a music program and a kind of gardening program in Massachusetts. So there are ways to do this coordinated care in communities. And so now, one last thing I just want to touch again on that word civility, because it seems like we need that. Its association with manners can be very troubling. And yet, as we move forward in time, civility can build these kind of open communities with new interactions, leading to unpredictable kinds of cooperation. It's a new open kind of civility that we want to create. A good example of a self-organization space is this park in Vancouver, BC. The community built this sign as a joke. So this was not the park district, this was a joke. They were goofing around. And of course the park district said, no, we got to get that sign out of here. But essentially the community petitioned and said, no, we want it, this is officially what it needs to be called. And so finally the Board of Parks relented and said, okay, that will be the official name of the park. So those are great examples. That's what we mean by self-organization spaces. And then in that previous Habitat Intergenerational Program, they call it HIP, it has a particularly good phrase. They say about their program, it dispels myths about how the young and old should interact. And it promotes the joy of learning together. So that's all. Thank you. Any questions are welcome if anybody has any questions.
Sorry, I can maybe a little bit like, why is this model called kidCities?
I'm sorry?
Why is the model called kidCities?
Oh, why is the model called kidCities? The model is the mechanism. It's a mechanism for evolving places. It's called kidCities because city planning in the 20th century was kind of a means to a fixed end point. This is an evolutionary mechanism. We don't have green cities. We have cities all over America that need to be fixed. So we want to find a solution that can evolve into something better. And the key thing about the old industrialized cities, which is where city planning came from, is they banished children to the exterior. Not only did they want children away from a central business district, but it even led to land-grant universities. So in America, we have all these land-grant universities, and it was based on a philosophy that cities are bad and nature is good. And so we want to bring kids and real life back into cities, because cities are also good. There's great culture. It's where you're going to meet diverse people. And nature can also be quite difficult. We have storms, earthquakes. So that old philosophy of cities evil, nature good, is no longer appropriate.
I would say the challenge with that is like that ideology essentially eliminates a lot of Oregon. Like the way you phrase that sort of eliminates the potential for this application to a number of our rural communities, which is probably 95% of the land mass of Oregon. So how do we use these tenants like in some of our smaller communities that are 20,000 people?
Actually, I think it works really well in small places. I used architectural examples, but it can work very well in small places. And some of the conversations, like one of the earlier conversations today was about the labor cost of construction in some places in Oregon. For whatever reason, there's anomalies, of course, that's the way natural systems are. And the biggest thing is that now we're networked. So what we can do is we can network multiple small places together, and that gives them greater economic power and political power to make things happen. So I would say at one level, operationally, it's through better networking of similar sized places, so these small towns can network better. And then secondly, the kidCities approach, even in a small town, if you coordinate the transportation in a small town and create some community centers, that can change it will increase the interactions. It's kind of like that jail. I mean, that jail is across the street from the county courthouse, and it's no longer the jail. But the other thing that happened is maybe here's a more tangible example to America. We frequently put schools outside of these old towns. Like when you think of these old little towns across Oregon, frequently we built grade schools and high schools far away from town. So of course there's less interaction. Now there's fewer people downtown. And part of those reasons was because this is the central business district. We can't have children around. But I do think we can bring those schools back into the towns. That was a kind of a particularly interesting one in this little tiny village in Tuscany. I couldn't believe it. I mean, they had all this open space outside of their town, but the grade schools were all right inside the village. So there's no reason that we have to push kids to the perimeter.
Do you have, or your firm have a website that talks about a little bit more about this model?
Yes.
Your project?
Yes. The firm website is animatearchitecture.com, and we're building the kidCities mechanism out. So, but we do have kidcities.org because that will be nonprofit. Yes.
I was wondering, how does this mechanism or model consider social issues? So like, I mean, I can think of a lot on different scales, but in like access to sidewalks, or like the ways that buildings are built, or like in mixed space projects, how do you, like facilitating community in a way that is not, that like actually does the thing you're hoping to do?
That's a very good question. The mechanism itself specifies open space. I mean, when I started this talk, I said I'm only an architect. And even with businesses, if I work with scientists or a new business, startup or whatever, when you're designing a building for them, we design the place, but at the end of the day, the people that live there are the ones that are going to make it work or not. And I know that all of these challenges are difficult. And I know that I don't have that expertise, so I can't help you with the social work. I do as much research as I can about it. And like I said, some of these elder care, child care joint facilities, some have worked and some have not. Sometimes one of the statistics I heard was they work for about 4 years, and then people lose the ability to manage it. So it's not easy. But then going back to just the architectural part of it, I think these principles of distinct environments surrounded by a central place is what can help. Because when you say it's a distinct environment, that means, like for example, the audio consultants idea, 5 different listening rooms. But those could be equally 5 different businesses. One is elderly care, one is child care, one is a store, and one is an online business. Who knows? And they can just share the common space. The other thing about the elderly care and child care that they mentioned was, although you get the great photo ops, which is excellent for funding, they said that the actual interactions between elderly people and young don't need to be that frequent. So sometimes just having them co-located is good enough, and maybe they interact once every 2 months. So it doesn't have to be a consistent, fully integrated program. So yeah.
I'm going to ask this, and I know that I may be the only one this affects. To go back to the earlier question about the rurals, I'm from a
frontier community, so can you expand a little on the networking idea? Our nearest neighbor is a town 345 miles away. Like, we are isolated, so what does networking look like for a community like that?
There's a lot of ways to look at that, but I'm going to think about it just in terms of schooling. Okay. So, nursery school, kindergarten, elementary school, high school. Those correspond to these 7 levels of organization I was talking about. In a town of 300, or hopefully a few thousand, you want to network with whatever towns are near you, so that even at the elementary school, maybe really more like high school, definitely, but maybe at the elementary school, you might go to the other town so 2 different grade schools, one has a bigger gym and one has a bigger science room or something like that. So you want to share facilities so that you get a higher quality facility. Another way to think about that is construction has changed radically. I mean, especially in Oregon frontier community. I mean, in the old days, you could build everything out of wood, and you needed a few panes of glass, and you just burned a lot of wood to stay warm. So, but nowadays we have all kinds of insulation, we have different regulations, more complex foundations for buildings. We have vinyl windows, insulated windows. So the complexity is increasing, and so it's better to the construction in your community has to be networked around the state. I mean, I guess what I'm getting at is kind of prefabrication can bring lower cost construction to your community. And maybe it's also coordinating the projects in a smaller community. So you need 3 houses and a school addition. Coordinate all that construction into one. There's another great idea about co-housing. It's a European idea, which is also shared facilities. They share kitchen facilities and so forth. And so for smaller communities, that's another way to look at it. All right, thank you.